I wanted to take you on a quick tour of our fall gardens. We just finally got a rain after a long drought, and last week we transplanted a whole lot of little seedlings. So right here, this area has been completely redone. In our courtyards, we've got a lot of lettuces off to the left, and here we have a combination of probably cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower, which we planted in other places as well. So just follow me as we go to some other areas. Here, unfortunately, we had an early frost and it knocked out all the green beans, which were just about ready to produce. So we pulled those up, and again we planted, you can see little butter crunch type lettuces, some big mustard greens here, and green onions, and those three that I'll mention in a lot of the garden areas: broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower. Then over here, we've got a lot of spinach growing, and we've been improving this area. We've got a lot of extra lettuces, which we plan on putting a greenhouse here, which we can transplant as we harvest the other areas. Walking over here, we're planting in, we need to weed this to give them more room, but we're transplanting, we planted different lettuces here. And again, you can see some of the bigger plants are the broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage. We pulled up all of our sweet potatoes, and we had such a long drought, I should have been watering them like 3 times a week. I didn't water them enough, so we probably got maybe 2 5-gallon buckets of sweet potatoes, not really that much, but we've replanted in all these extra seedlings. We overplanted other areas, and on the end, we've got root crops. I've replanted some. Hopefully they'll be coming up pretty quickly. I'm starting to see seedlings of beets here, carrots, but what we can see the actual greens from, we've got some turnips starting to come up over here. I've replanted several of these, and then we have another root crop over here as well, radishes. We'll go to our front gardens now. Long front garden, typically one of our most productive areas, and didn't do too well in spinach. Here we have some coming up, but I've planted some other greens. Here we need to thin this out. These are collard greens. Kale, we've done a lot of thinning out of the kale and planting that other areas like on our little farm. Here's where, did you see all those lettuce seeds in the backyard? This is where we thinned them out, from right here. We've got a root garden here that's not doing very well. I may end up getting rid of this area, but we have a few lettuces volunteering, but some carrots here, turnips, and possibly other root crops that will be coming up. But all those seedlings you saw where I kept saying cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli, where did that come from? I overplanted this area, which I typically do sometimes in the spring, but especially the fall. When it cools down and rains, that's when I can transplant successfully. So we thinned it out to about 18 inches apart and planted the whole area. Here we have green onions coming up from probably planted last year, and we're just snipping them off, not pulling them up, but snipping them off and using them as we need them. And we can see this coming all the way down here. Now it's spread out, and this area these plants should really take off quickly. And we have a way where we can cover them and even run heat lamps as we get into colder weather. All right, I'm back with you now to explore the Word with you. You might wonder why Brother Lanford gave me a tour of all the fall gardens. Well, now we're going to relate to the spiritual realm, friend. So our talk at this time is entitled Born Again to Reproduce, or to reproduce Christ, or to make disciples. So we just went to all of our fall gardens at our home. We actually have a small farm where we transplanted a lot more of those same kind of seedlings, and we had already planted a lot of mustard greens, collard greens, and other root crops as well. So the whole point of that was to get you thinking about being fruitful. So we're going to start off with a review, though. We've had 2 teachings before this on what is a disciple and the characteristics of a disciple. So I'm going to just simply go over in a few bullet points, but I won't reread the scriptures, and you can watch those videos again if you missed either one of those recent videos. True disciples spend a lot of time with Jesus, learning from him. True disciples' lives have been and are being transformed. True disciples put Christ's kingdom first. Instead of coming up with their own plan, the 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plan, they earnestly seek the Lord and get their instructions from him. True disciples take his commands seriously and obey them. They realize this may require obedience into dark and difficult areas. True disciples prioritize their relationship with Jesus above all others. True disciples daily deny themselves and die to themselves and follow Christ. They realize that their lives do not belong to them. They are willing to make major adjustments in their lives to follow Christ. True disciples do not choose the easy, comfortable life. I'll pause for a plane to go overhead. Instead, they live to please their commanding officer. True disciples endure when persecution comes. However, those who simply profess Christ but lack roots may fall away when persecution comes. That's from Matthew 13, verse 21 in the parable of the sower. And now to tonight's lesson. True disciples, or we could say healthy disciples, bear fruit. When I plant various crops, I'm looking for them to sprout and to come up and produce. And typically the process lasts about 3 months before I get a harvest. Sometimes 2 if it's a quick crop of some sort. Healthy disciples bear fruit. God's first commandment to mankind was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Later on, after the Lord had to destroy the whole earth, and only Noah and his family went into the ark. Others were invited, Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. What did God say to them when they got off the ark? He gave the same command: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And if you look at many lists in the Old Testament where God is talking about blessings and curses, the blessings right towards the very beginning of that list would be they would be blessed with children. And a curse would be they would be barren. And so if you have chickens, egg-laying chickens, you're expecting eggs. And if you have 30 chickens and you're only getting 6 eggs, that's pretty poor. Not very productive, right? It might be time to sell off those chickens or slaughter them and eat them and buy new ones, young ones that will be productive. Well, God is looking for fruit from us as well. Now, before I talk about that spiritual fruit, I want to talk about physical fruit from your body. God made our bodies to reproduce. Of course, He made that all animals and plants that way. And when he first created this earth, he blessed the animals and the plants, and he expected them, he designed them to be very fruitful. Otherwise, if an animal doesn't reproduce, it could go extinct, right? And we see this with humans, although when I was growing up, especially in high school and reading the book, The Population Bomb, I was made to think, oh, wow, we're going to run out of resources. That was back in the 70s, and they predicted we'd run out of key resources and petroleum and all sorts of things by the year 2000. Guess what? That didn't happen. We learned how to manage the resources. We found out that the earth was more resilient and more productive than what we thought. We learned how to be more productive in raising our crops, our rice, our wheat, and other key crops, so we could feed more people. And now, actually, in some cases, because of forced sterilization, forced birth control on people who didn't want it, and just the whole mentality of people changing, some countries, their population has gone way below replacement level. I'm thinking of some of the small Eastern European countries, that they are strongly incentivizing just their tax code, and just they're doing everything they can to encourage married couples to have children. And my whole mentality had to change in this. This is a part of my testimony perhaps you haven't heard me share. So I was so immersed in the zero population growth mentality, or the idea that the earth was way too overpopulated, that I thought, man, it would be like irresponsible to have any children, or maybe to have more than two. And that was the idea I had going into marriage. But my wife had a very strange conviction, or it seemed that way to me, to let God be in control of the womb. And I don't know if I had even really heard of that, or I might have thought that sure is backward, or that's from 100 years ago or something, when we had big farming families and needed all the extra hands we could get to bring in the crops and so on. So I began to study the Bible. Guess what? Couldn't find any scriptures at all to support my point of view, which it turned out was a secular or anti-biblical point of view, that children are a burden and we shouldn't have hardly any, and they'll get in the way. And I even thought children would get in the way of ministry or the calling of God. And again, that's not a biblical mindset. And so I had to change. God had to change my mind and my heart and expand my heart so I could let Him bless us with all the children He wanted to. And we're very blessed to have 8 children. They're all adults. They all love the Lord. We home educated them, which was another conviction my wife had. And as I studied the scriptures and came to realize the tremendous responsibility given to Christian parents to raise their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and to thoroughly disciple them, I realized, wow, home education is probably the best way to do that. Now, I'm not saying home education is the only way, and it's for every single Christian parent. There's some that may not be able to do that, but there are good Christian schools that are available, or co-ops or something for a parent who may not be able to shoulder that responsibility, or a single mom. But as a former and now retired public school teacher, I urge all people watching this not to send your children or entrust them to a public school, because they will be thoroughly indoctrinated in an anti-biblical worldview, and it would be very unlikely that they would follow Christ. There are a few rare examples, but not many. Well, let's now, after talking about the blessing of children, now we're going to turn to the spiritual application of being fruitful and multiplying. And so we see, besides biological children, what are we to produce for God? Well, the Great Commission makes that clear. Matthew 28, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Therefore, go and make, not decisions, disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the close of the age. Now, how do we do this? Well, we just read that scripture. It's not just by passing out tracts, which I've done a lot of that, and leaving tracts various places, or talking to people about the Lord. That's a good start, isn't it? But it said teaching them to obey. So after the person is won to Christ, and you might not actually be the person to win that person, maybe someone else did, but they need to be taught how to follow the Lord. And we're going to go into more specifics of how to disciple people in future lessons. God's will, friend, is for you to produce much eternal fruit that will endure. I spent, about a year and a half ago, I spent maybe several weeks just meditating on John 15. So I encourage you to turn there with me at this time. And I'm only going to point out the places that talk about bearing fruit or not bearing fruit and the consequences of being barren. I'm in John 15, and I'll tell you the verses I've chosen for this, but the passage, if you want to read it, is verses 1 through 17. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. That was verses 1 and 2. I'm skipping down now, so we've heard the word no fruit or fruitful twice. It actually mentions it 7 times, or at least I'm going to point out. There might be more, but here's 7 instances I wanted to point out. In verse 4, no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Did you hear fruit or no fruit 2 more times? I'm skipping down to verse 5. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. 5 times. Skipping down to verse 8. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit. I'm expecting a great fall garden from all those little seedlings. They're about this big now, and if I can protect them from frosts, then we should have a lot of greens for months to come. Here's the 6th one. Actually, I just read that was number 6, and number 7, skip down to verse 16. You did not choose me, but I chose you to go and bear fruit that will last. So when he says you cannot do, apart from me, you cannot do anything, you can do a lot of things. You could build a building. You could get a doctoral degree or work up to running a marathon or something like that. But we're talking about eternal fruit. You can't do that on your own. Apart from Christ, can you? Neither can I. Wow, 7 times God just wanted to make sure we saw how important it is to bear fruit. Well, in closing, I wanted to, in applying what we've talked about in this lesson, I wanted to give you a challenge. And that is, within the next year, be praying, try to pray every day, that asking the Lord to help you grow as a disciple, asking the Lord to help you become fruitful in His kingdom, and your goal, I'm asking, challenging you, is to win a person or to and or to take a new believer and disciple them. And again, we'll be going over how to do that in a future lesson. And then if you're in a small group, cell group, home group, whatever your church may call them, make it your goal to that all of you will grow as disciples, new leaders will be raised up, and grow that group and multiply it within 1 year. Let's do a little self-assessment right now with using the following questions. Friend, how well are you doing in making disciples? Can you name any that you have discipled in the last few years? And how are they doing in following the Lord? Have they continued in the faith? Are they continued attached to a local church and growing, being a blessing? That's pretty challenging, those questions, isn't it? See, it's not just winning someone or trying to get them to say a quick prayer and say, wow, 500 decisions for Christ we had in our church. Well, how many of those did we disciple, baptize and disciple? That's what we need to actually count, because that's what they did in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. This calls for serious focus in our life, doesn't it? And one of my life verses is John 12:24, and it says, Jesus said, and I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains by itself. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And who is that original kernel of wheat, or that would the kernel of wheat represent? Our lives. But the original one was Jesus. Shortly after that, he fell into the ground. He died for the sins of the world, and then was buried, and then rose again, and he set the example for us. Of course, we're not going to die on a cross for the sins of the world, but we're to die to ourselves, fall into the ground, and again I'm speaking spiritually, so that we can bear much fruit, remain attached to Christ, die to our own desires, our own plans, and find out what Christ wants us to do, and then learn how to become fruitful in His kingdom. Thank you, and God bless you, friend.